Today we've got the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's so great to be with you.
So what's the state of negotiations right now in terms of where the party is on the Build Back Better plan, the reconciliation package, and when might we expect to see a final version of the bill ready to put on the floor?
Well, I think the really good news is that both parts of the Build Back Better agenda, the president's agenda, that is the smaller infrastructure bill and the bigger Build Back Better Act, are now both back on track. There was a moment a couple of weeks ago when it looked like only the infrastructure bill was going to move forward, and that would have meant that 85% of the president's agenda would get left behind. And so now we are pushing both bills forward at the same time. The negotiations are continuing between Senators Manchin and Sinema, who are the two that we're still waiting for in terms of full agreement around the package. Everyone else agrees. We have already drafted the bill in the House. And now we're just waiting for that final moment where we get every single vote, because as you know, Brian, the margins are slim in the House and the Senate. And while it's great to have 98%, it's not 100%.
I know you've been mired in these negotiations, and I apologize if you're confronting this question on an endless loop and if it's ringing in your ears when you go to bed, but what does Kyrsten Sinema want as far as the reconciliation package is concerned? And, are you getting more from the inside than we're getting on the outside?
No, not really. I don't know. She is having conversations directly with the White House. What I can tell you is she is having those conversations, and we are moving, even though sometimes it looks like we're not, that we're stuck in an eddy. We are moving. It's just a little more slowly, and it's probably a little more opaque than we would all like. So we don't know all the details of those negotiations, but what I will tell you is I think that the thing that gives me a lot of hope that we're going to get this done, and we're going to get it done hopefully relatively quickly, is, Brian, people are so excited by what is in the Build Back Better Act when they realize that we're fighting for 12 weeks of paid family leave for every single American. When they realize that we're fighting for universal childcare so that no family is going to pay more than 7% of their income on childcare. When they realize that, yes, we are actually going to get real action on climate change, not just something that's superficial, but actually reduce carbon emissions by half. That is really important. Housing, which has been such a big issue for all of our cities across the country, building affordable housing and helping people to be housed in the richest country in the world. And then, of course, lifting up our immigrant communities who have lifted us up for so long. And finally, healthcare, being able to expand Medicare benefits to include dental, vision, and hearing for our seniors, being able to expand Medicaid, make sure that people that haven't had access to Medicaid in certain states are able to get that access. Those are the things that are in the Build Back Better agenda. And it's why we're fighting so hard to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind.
I'm glad that you brought up a lot of those, everything that's in the bill, basically, because what's happening here and what happens normally is that we're confronting a right-wing ecosystem that immediately consolidates to attack everything in the bill, bad faith arguments and disingenuous arguments. What are Democrats doing to push back against the usual barrage of disinformation and misinformation that that we normally get and that we're getting right now with regard to this reconciliation package?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because of course we're stuck in a position where we need every single Democrat to vote for it, which the counter to that is that not a single Republican is going to vote for this bill. And that is really, really unfortunate. It's just like the American Rescue Plan, where we cut child poverty in half, and we got shots in arms, and we got assistance to small businesses and state and local governments. Not a single Republican voted for that, even though, over 70% of Americans wanted those things.
Right.
So that's the same place where we're in today. We're trying to get people to understand, and what you're doing is so important for people to understand what it is that's in the bill that we're fighting for, because all these ads from pharmaceutical companies who don't want us to negotiate prescription drug prices, from Wall Street and the biggest, individual donors and, wealthiest individuals and wealthiest corporations that don't want to pay their fair share in taxes. That's another part of how we're paying for this that I forgot to mention. All of those interests are coming out to try to say, this is a bad thing. It's not going to help you. When in fact, what we know is these investments would be transformational. So the best thing we can do is talk about it, make sure people know what's in there, and then also get everybody out there to call your Congress member to say, this is something we really want to see enacted. It will transform my life. That's, I think, very, very important for us to hear.
Now, Nancy Pelosi had come out a few days ago in support of including fewer programs and doing it better. Now, what's your position on this? And is there anything to be said for including all of the programs for less time, like 5 years instead of 10 years to bring the price tag down?
Yeah, Speaker Pelosi actually did say that, but then the very next day said, well, actually, we want to include all of the major programs that the Progressive Caucus has identified as the key transformational programs, the ones I mentioned, including pre-K, by the way. When we talk about the care economy, it's childcare, pre-K, and also home and community-based care. So when she was asked about the specific priorities I mentioned, she said what will likely happen is we'll shorten the number of years that those programs are funded for in order to bring down the total amount of money that's required. But there are other areas where, perhaps we don't need to do them. So she really walked back those comments. And I think our position, a majority of our Progressive Caucus members, and frankly, I think also the White House has been much more in favor of, we can't pit childcare against climate change. We can't pit pre-K against housing. Yeah. These are all really important transformational things. We can't pit young people against seniors. Like, each one has a different constituency and all of them are urgent. So our view as the Progressive Caucus is, let's do these 5 priorities. Let's make sure they're all in there. And if we need to shorten the time that they're funded to bring down the price, then we'll do that.
By the way, if we do less time, we can then try to extend them once people recognize and realize how good they are, just like what happened with the ACA.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, once people understand that government's got my back, right, and that I can wake up in the morning and I can now go to work because I have childcare, or my kids now have pre-K, those kinds of things are things that make people feel differently about their lives. And that's what we need if we want to then preserve those programs into the future. A road and a bridge is great. We all need them. I'm for the infrastructure bill. I hope we pass it. But it doesn't change the way people feel if you can't even get on that road because you don't have care for your kids.
Now, one of the ideas that was floated, kind of building on exactly what you're talking about feeling the impacts of this bill, one of the ideas that was floated was that the Medicare dental benefits wouldn't kick in until 2028. Is there an acknowledgement now of the importance of touching people's lives right now? Not only because they need the help, but because politically speaking, it's crazy to defer this until after the president, after this president's not even in office anymore, much less, next year's midterms, which is when voters effectively grade Democrats.
Totally. And that is actually how we came up with our priorities, is we said, what are the things that are, number one, transformational? Number two, can deliver benefits immediately. We want people to feel the difference in the first 6 to 12 months. And then what are the things that are as universal as possible, will touch as many families as possible? And so that's how we came up with our things. The dental benefits not being able to be implemented until 2028, in my mind, doesn't make sense. We think they can be implemented much sooner. There's also the option of doing other kinds of things, like perhaps a dental voucher for the first couple of years if it takes a while to get the dental benefits going. I will also say that I've been a big fan of pushing for lowering the Medicare eligibility age, which isn't totally off the table. But if we did that, we would bring 14 million people onto Medicare, allow people to retire at 62 and know that they were going to have health care, and help a lot of our nurses that have been on the front lines, our firefighters, people whose bodies have really taken the toll, but they can't even think about stopping because they aren't going to have health care. So that's another one I think we should put back on the table. And I've been telling the White House that because, again, 14 million people would get benefit from that, and it would happen immediately. And everybody loves their Medicare. Not that we can't improve it, we're trying to improve it, but it's such an important, popular program because it really does provide comprehensive quality care.
Yeah, and including my parents, by the way, they fall into that category of, if you lowered the Medicare age, both of them are healthcare workers, and they would both benefit from that, and they would thank you for that as well. So that was a
Exactly.
quick
That is
curiosity.
so, yeah, actually, just on that for a second, first of all, tell them thank you because we're working hard to get that done. Secondly, this is something that the Progressive Caucus prioritized early on. It went far beyond progressives. We actually got 15 of the most vulnerable Democrats and the toughest districts across the country to endorse this and push for this with us and 70% of the Democratic caucus, because it is so transformational. People understand it immediately, like your
Yeah,
parents. They know what Medicare is. They feel like they deserve it. It's not like getting a handout from the government, as some
yeah.
people think about some programs. It's really something that they've earned and they're ready to have at 62, just like Social Security.
You mentioned these Democrats in vulnerable districts. Now, you've got moderates and centrists who we feel like hold all the cards here, but why don't progressives play just as much hardball, knowing that at the end of the day, the Representative Jayapals are in safe districts. The Elizabeth Warrens are in safe Senate seats. But it's those very moderates from swing districts who will have to explain to their constituents why they should be reelected despite nothing passing if they're the ones who, block this bill.
Well, the amazing thing about this is it was kind of framed in the media as progressives versus moderates, but actually, almost everyone in the Democratic
Yeah,
Party agreed. It was not, I mean, I have a lot of those friends that are in those most vulnerable districts who wanted the Build Back Better Act as it was written in the House to pass. They were perfectly
yeah.
fine with it. They wanted to pass both. But there were a small handful that didn't feel that way. And so that's sort of what blocked us. We thought we had an agreement out of the Senate. Clearly, we don't. So now we have to go back. But one of my friends who's in one of the toughest districts in the country was talking to me last night, and she said, it's fine. We want the bipartisan bill. Of course we do, the infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
But what my constituents really want are these other things. And we have no hope of being reelected. If we promised that we would get these things when we campaigned, it's the president's agenda, it's the Democratic agenda. And then if we don't deliver on those things and all we deliver is the roads and bridges bill, that is not going to help us politically down the road. We really need to deliver the entirety of the agenda. In addition to it being the right thing to do for our constituents, it is also politically the best thing to do.
You're looking at, allowing the government to negotiate lower drug prices is polling at like 83%. You couldn't get that consensus on the day of the week, in that body. But yeah.
Almost every single thing in this package, Brian, is like that, and then if you add the tax piece on, which is let's make the tax system fair so that this ends up being a $0 bill because it's completely paid for by just making the wealthy pay their fair share, the numbers go even higher. People are like, yeah, they should pay their fair share. I pay my fair share. You should pay your fair share too.
The fact that the way to pay for this thing is even more popular than the provisions itself is a testament to how well this was crafted and how important it is to pass. Moving over to voting rights, while the Build Back Better bill is being negotiated, we're also running out of time with regard to other top legislative priorities. Now, Senator Schumer announced that he'd be putting the Freedom to Vote Act on the floor for a vote. Of course, that's, what's going to happen is that Republicans will filibuster it, and that's where it'll end. So I know you're in the House, and this is obviously an issue that really concerns, the Senate, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema specifically. But could you give us some insight into what it's like behind the scenes? Because, out here, it's hard to understand how there's this seemingly inability to confront the fact that Republicans are literally legislating Democrats out of government, and a refusal to stop it is just, so aggressively self-defeating.
Yes. And this is, what you're bringing up, I think, is the most important thing we're confronting today. We voters think that voting is critically important, right? Everybody deserves the right to vote, should have the right to vote. And that once you've elected people, that the majority should rule. So in other words, if you deliver the House, the Senate, and the White House to Democrats, then Democrats should be able to get everything done. That is theoretically how it should work. However, what is happening now is that Republicans have decided that since they can't win elections in the traditional way by actually winning elections, they are going to either buy into the big lie, as in Joe Biden didn't win the election and Donald Trump did, and I shouldn't say and they're going to try and suppress the vote as much as they possibly can, which is why we've had hundreds of these voter suppression bills across the country. So for us to move a bill, we've already passed the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act through the House. It works just on a simple majority. If there are 51% of Democrats, we pass a bill. In the Senate, because of this racist Jim Crow legacy called the filibuster, it means that the tyranny of the minority, 40 senators, can block a bill from even being voted on. I'm not talking about the final vote. I'm just talking about bringing the bill to the floor for a vote. And that is called the filibuster. You need 60 votes to move a bill to the floor. And so they've been able to block everything. So now, in my mind, what we have to do is we have to reform or eliminate the filibuster. It's a relic of Jim Crow. It was used by Southern segregationists to stop, any kind of progress on civil rights legislation. And now that's the way it's continuing to be used. And it's blocking everything: voting rights, immigration reform, LGBTQ equality, you name it. Gun safety, we can go down the list. So the way to do that is Democrats can do what Mitch McConnell and Republicans already did on taxes. For this, GOP tax scam that they did, $2 trillion tax scam. They said we only need 50 votes, 50 plus one. That's called the budget reconciliation process. Well, we could do the same thing for civil rights and voting rights. And we could say, we're going to reform the filibuster so that you cannot have the minority block this. And my view, Brian, is that this is the single most important thing we have to do. If we don't do this, then we are never, ever going to have a functioning democracy, because the vote is going to be suppressed in all kinds of ways across the country to ensure that Democrats don't win. It's a broken system and it needs to be fixed. And it's incredibly frustrating.
You mentioned all of the other legislation that's being hindered by the filibuster. Obviously we have gun reforms, the Equality Act, the George Floyd and Justice and Policing Act. One of the other pieces of legislation that's languishing is the Women's Health Protection Act. Now, yes. I know that you have your own story on this. Why is it important for you for this to get voted on and passed?
Well, I testified about this in the House Oversight Committee a couple of weeks ago. I am one of the 1 in 4 women across the country that has had an abortion. And the reality is that the vast majority of Americans believe that abortion should be accessible and safe and affordable. And now the same thing that is happening with voting rights is happening with abortion, where we are seeing state legislatures come forward with these incredibly restrictive laws to prevent pregnant people from having abortions, from making choices about their own bodies. And I told my story because these are such personal, nuanced decisions. And they only affect the person that's carrying that is pregnant, plus, whoever that person chooses to bring in. And the idea that somebody would tell me that I can't have an abortion, or that I have to carry a pregnancy that is dangerous, that endangers my life, that endangers the life of the baby, or simply for economic reasons, I'm not able to have a child in that particular moment, is really about other people trying to assert control, and largely men trying to assert control over pregnant people's choices. And that is absolutely untenable. So we have been pushing to codify Roe v. Wade, because the Supreme Court, of course, said it was constitutional, but with Donald Trump's nominations to the Supreme Court, we're not sure that they're going to continue to uphold that constitutional right. And if that happens, Brian, we would go back to the days of dark alley abortions, and it would be poor women and people of color that would be most disproportionately affected, because they would not be able to access those choices and make those choices for themselves.
I guess this all begs the question, and I'm not sure if you'd have insight into this, but if for nothing else, then my own to calm me down. What are your thoughts on ultimately seeing some type of a reform or elimination of the filibuster?
Well, I'm hopeful, but I'm an optimist. I'm an organizer. I've always believed that we can make these things happen, and that courage comes out of crisis. And if there's ever been a time when we've been in crisis, it's right now. I was in the gallery, Brian, on January 6th. I was trapped there as insurrectionists were pounding on the door and trying to find Nancy Pelosi and Mike Pence to kill them, and trying to kill us as members of Congress. And I saw how incredibly close and fragile we were to losing our democracy. And if we don't reform the filibuster and pass voting rights and ensure that all of the civil rights protections and voting rights protections that we have to be able to put in place for us to really say this is a democracy in truth, then we're going to lose it. So I believe that there is real hope that we can do this. And the reason I believe that is because Senator Manchin redrafted the For the People Act in a way that he felt was sensible. It has the majority of the things in there, but not everything, but the majority of things. And he believes he can find 10 Republicans. More power to him. I hope he finds 10 Republicans. But if he doesn't, I think then even his faith could be shaken in the need to preserve the filibuster. And perhaps we could, at a minimum, get a carve out for voting rights and civil rights so that we could move these bills forward. Anybody who says that the filibuster preserves bipartisanship, I would actually argue the opposite, Brian, that the filibuster makes it so that even if you had 2 or 3 or 4 Republicans who supported something like voting rights, which you would have thought would have been a no-brainer, they're not going to come on board because you need 10. And so why would they put themselves out there if the thing isn't going to go anywhere anyway? So I would argue that by having just a simple majority, you actually, in a divided Senate, allow for more bipartisanship and not less. And I hope that Senators Manchin and Sinema see that and are willing to, at a minimum, have this kind of a carve out to reform the filibuster.
And I think it's a safe argument that protecting voting rights is a lot more important for a carve out in the filibuster than it was when Republicans did the exact same thing for both tax breaks and to confirm judges.
Supreme Court. That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
So anyway, thank you so much for the work you're doing to keep this bill as broad as possible so that it could touch as many people's lives as possible. And I appreciate you coming on.
Well, thank you so much for everything you're doing to educate people about what's going on. We really appreciate you breaking it down.